The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestones of Windsor Castle as Thomas Mitchell adjusted his red tunic for what he knew would be the last time. After 35 years of service as a Queen's Guard, retirement felt both liberating and terrifying. The 58-year-old veteran had spent decades standing motionless, his face a mask of stoic professionalism, protecting the royal family through countless ceremonies, protests, and public events. Thomas remembered his first day clearly. He was just 23, fresh from military training, nervous about joining one of the world's most prestigious guard units. The older guards had warned him about the rules. Never break character. Never show emotion. Never acknowledge the public unless absolutely necessary. These weren't just guidelines. They were sacred traditions that had been maintained for centuries. Over the years, Thomas had become a master of the art. He could stand for hours without moving, ignore jeering tourists, and maintain his composure, even when children tried to make him laugh or adults attempted to distract him with silly antics. His fellow guards respected him and the royal family trusted him completely. He had protected 3 different monarchs and witnessed history unfold before his very eyes. But today was different. As Thomas walked through the castle grounds, he noticed an elderly man sitting alone on a bench near the main gate. The man wore a worn military jacket covered in medals, and his weathered hand shook slightly as he held a small photograph. Something about the scene made Thomas pause, though he couldn't quite explain why. The elderly man looked up as Thomas approached. His eyes were cloudy with age, but there was a sharpness there that spoke of years of service and sacrifice. The photograph in his hand showed a young soldier in uniform, standing proudly beside what appeared to be his family. "Excuse me, sir," the elderly man said quietly, his voice trembling with emotion. "I was wondering if you might know anything about my son. He served here as a guard about 15 years ago. His name was David Harrison." Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. He remembered David well. The young man had been full of life and dedication, always eager to learn and improve. David had died in Afghanistan during his deployment with the regular army, just 2 years after leaving the Queen's Guard. Thomas had attended the funeral, standing in full-dress uniform alongside dozens of other guards who had come to pay their respects. But protocol demanded that Thomas remain professional. He wasn't supposed to engage in lengthy conversations with the public, especially while in uniform. The rules were clear, and breaking them could result in disciplinary action or even dismissal. Yet looking at this grieving father, Thomas felt something shift inside him. "I did know your son, sir," Thomas said quietly, glancing around to make sure no supervisors were nearby. David was an exceptional guard and an even better man. The elderly man's eyes filled with tears. "I haven't been able to visit his grave in months. My health isn't what it used to be, and the journey is too difficult now. But I wanted to come here, to see where he worked, to feel close to him again." Thomas felt his own eyes beginning to moisten, something that hadn't happened while in uniform for over 3 decades. The weight of 35 years of suppressed emotion suddenly felt overwhelming. Every funeral he had attended, every family he had met, every moment of grief he had witnessed while maintaining his stoic facade came rushing back. "Your son talked about you often," Thomas continued, his voice growing softer. "He was incredibly proud of his military heritage. He said his father had taught him everything he knew about honor and duty." The elderly man smiled through his tears. "He was everything to me after his mother passed. I just wanted to know that his service mattered, that people remembered him." At that moment, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He looked around once more, then slowly removed his bearskin hat, setting it carefully on the bench beside the grieving father. The action was unprecedented, a clear violation of protocol, but Thomas no longer cared about the rules. "Sir, would you like me to show you where David used to stand guard?" Thomas asked, his voice filled with genuine warmth. "I can tell you stories about his time here, about the pride he brought to the uniform." The elderly man nodded eagerly, and Thomas helped him to his feet. As they walked slowly through the castle grounds, other guards began to notice what was happening. Some looked shocked, others confused. The sight of a Queen's Guard without his hat, walking casually with a civilian, was almost unthinkable. But as Thomas began sharing memories of David, something extraordinary happened. Other guards started approaching, drawn by the unusual scene. They had all known David, and they had all felt the loss when he died. Slowly, one by one, they began to join the conversation. Guard Captain William Hayes was the first to notice the growing group. His initial instinct was to intervene, to restore order and remind everyone of their duties. But as he got closer and overheard the conversation, he found himself thinking about his own son, currently serving overseas. The rules suddenly seemed less important than the humanity of the moment. Thomas continued sharing stories about David, describing his dedication, his humor, and his dream of one day returning to civilian life to become a teacher. The elderly man listened intently, tears streaming down his face, but his expression was one of joy rather than sorrow. He wanted to teach history, the old man said softly. He said understanding the past was the only way to build a better future. As the morning progressed, more guards gathered around the small group. Some shared their own memories of David, while others simply stood in silent support. The scene was unprecedented in the history of the Queen's Guard, but somehow it felt completely right. Thomas looked around at his fellow guards, realizing that this moment was bigger than protocol or tradition. It was about recognizing the humanity that existed beneath the uniform, acknowledging that even the most stoic soldiers were, at their core, human beings capable of deep emotion and connection. The elderly man squeezed Thomas's hand. "Thank you," he whispered. "This means more to me than you could ever know." Word of the unprecedented gathering spread quickly through Windsor Castle. Staff members whispered among themselves, uncertain how to handle the situation. Never in the castle's long history had so many guards abandoned their posts to gather around a civilian. The scene was both beautiful and concerning, depending on one's perspective. Captain Hayes found himself in an impossible position. Military protocol demanded immediate action to restore order, but the emotional weight of the moment made such intervention feel cruel and unnecessary. He watched as more guards continued to join the group, each sharing their own memories of David Harrison and offering comfort to his grieving father. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his impromptu tour, showing Mr. Harrison the exact spots where David had stood during various ceremonies. They paused at the main entrance where David had once helped a lost child find her parents, and at the side gate where he had quietly assisted an elderly woman who had fallen during a public event. "David never told me about these moments," Mr. Harrison said, his voice filled with wonder. He was always so modest about his service. Sergeant Maria Santos, who had worked alongside David during his final year as a guard, stepped forward. She was a petite woman with kind eyes, known among her colleagues for her unwavering dedication and her ability to maintain composure under the most challenging circumstances. But today her eyes were soft with unshed tears. "Sir, your son saved my career," she said quietly, addressing Mr. Harrison directly. "During my first week, I made a terrible mistake during a ceremony. I nearly fainted from the heat and started to sway. David noticed and subtly shifted his position to help support me without anyone else noticing. He could have been disciplined for breaking formation, but he chose to help a fellow guard instead." Mr. Harrison's face lit up with pride. That sounds exactly like something David would do. His mother always said he had a heart bigger than his head sometimes. The crowd of guards continued to grow, and with them came more stories. Guard after guard approached to share memories, each tale revealing another facet of David's character that his father had never known. There was the time David had quietly arranged for flowers to be sent to a colleague's wife when she was in the hospital. The day he had spent his own money to buy lunch for a homeless veteran who had been lingering near the castle gates. The countless occasions when he had volunteered for extra duties to help other guards who needed time off for family emergencies. As the stories continued, something remarkable began to happen. The rigid formality that typically defined the Queen's Guard started to dissolve. Guards who had worked together for years but had rarely spoken began opening up to each other. They shared their own experiences, their fears, their hopes, and their memories of lost friends and family members. Thomas realized that David's father had unknowingly created something that had been missing from their service for too long: genuine human connection. The rules and traditions that governed their behavior, while important for maintaining order and respect, had also created barriers between the men and women who served side by side. "I had no idea," Mr. Harrison said softly, looking around at the gathered guards. "David mentioned his colleagues, but he never told me how close you all were. It's like he had a whole other family here." "We were his family," Thomas replied, his voice thick with emotion, "and he was ours." When we lost him, we lost a brother. The sentiment resonated throughout the group. Nods and murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd as guards acknowledged the truth of Thomas's words. They had all grieved David's death, but they had done so in isolation, maintaining the stoic facade that their position demanded. Captain Hayes continued to watch from a distance, torn between his duty to maintain order and his growing understanding of what was happening. He thought about his own military service before joining the Queen's Guard, remembering the bonds he had formed with his fellow soldiers and the way they had supported each other through difficult times. His radio crackled to life, startling him from his thoughts. "Captain Hayes, we have reports of unusual activity at the main gate. Multiple guards appear to have abandoned their posts. Please respond." The voice belonged to Colonel Richardson, the commanding officer of the entire guard unit. Hayes knew he had only minutes before the situation would escalate beyond his control. He looked back at the group, now numbering nearly 20 guards, all gathered around the elderly veteran and his son's former colleague. "Sir," Hayes said, approaching Thomas carefully, "I need to speak with you privately." Thomas looked up, understanding immediately what was happening. He could see the conflict in his captain's eyes, the struggle between duty and humanity that was playing out in real time. "I know, sir," Thomas replied quietly. "I understand the position this puts you in." The two men walked a few steps away from the group, speaking in hushed tones while Mr. Harrison continued receiving comfort and stories from the other guards. "Thomas, you know I have to report this," Hayes said, his voice heavy with regret. "The colonel is already asking questions, and this situation is unprecedented. There will be consequences." Thomas nodded calmly. "I understand, sir, but I need you to know that I don't regret what I've done here today. This man lost his son, and his son was one of ours. Sometimes humanity has to come before protocol." Hayes looked back at the group, watching as guards continued to share memories and offer comfort to the grieving father. The scene was chaotic by military standards, but it was also beautiful in a way that was difficult to describe. "What do you want me to do, Thomas?" Hayes asked quietly. "How do we handle this situation without destroying what's been built here today?" Thomas considered the question carefully. He knew that his career was likely over regardless of what happened next. But the other guards deserved better. They had opened their hearts for the first time in years, and that vulnerability shouldn't be punished. "Give me 5 minutes to say goodbye to Mr. Harrison," Thomas said finally. "Then I'll take full responsibility for what happened here. Tell the colonel that I acted alone, that I pressured the others to participate. Let them return to their posts, and I'll face whatever consequences are necessary." Hayes shook his head. "Thomas, you can't protect everyone. They made their own choices to join this gathering." "Maybe," Thomas replied, "but I started it. And sometimes a leader has to take responsibility for the actions of his team, even when those actions come from the heart." The radio crackled again, more urgently this time. Colonel Richardson was clearly becoming impatient for answers, and Hayes knew he was running out of time to manage the situation quietly. Colonel Richardson arrived at the scene just as Thomas was preparing to return to his duties. The colonel was a stern man in his 60s, with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that had seen decades of military service. His reputation for maintaining discipline was legendary, and guards throughout the castle knew better than to cross him. But as Richardson approached the group, he noticed something unexpected. The guards weren't acting out of rebellion or disrespect. Instead, they were displaying a level of genuine emotion and camaraderie that he hadn't seen in years. The elderly man at the center of attention was clearly a military veteran, and the respectful way the guards were treating him spoke to their character rather than their lack of discipline. "Captain Hayes," Richardson called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades in command. "I need an immediate explanation for this situation." Hayes stepped forward, prepared to deliver the report that would likely result in disciplinary action for multiple guards. But before he could speak, Mr. Harrison slowly rose from the bench where he had been sitting and approached the colonel. "Sir," the elderly veteran said, his voice steady despite his obvious emotion, "please don't blame these young people for showing kindness to an old soldier. They've given me more comfort in the past hour than I've felt in months." Richardson looked down at the frail man, taking note of the military decorations on his jacket. Years of experience had taught him to recognize the signs of a combat veteran, and this man clearly bore those marks with honor. "And you are?" Richardson inquired, his tone softening slightly. Robert Harrison, sir. I served in the Falklands and Northern Ireland. My son David was a Queen's Guard here about 15 years ago. He died serving in Afghanistan in 2009. The colonel's expression changed immediately. He remembered David Harrison well. The young man had been an exemplary guard, and his death had affected the entire unit. Richardson had personally written the letter of condolence to the family and had attended the funeral in full dress uniform. David Harrison, Richardson repeated quietly. I remember him. He was a fine soldier and an honor to the uniform. These guards have been telling me stories about my son that I never knew, Mr. Harrison continued, gesturing to the group that had gathered around him, about his kindness, his dedication, his friendship with his fellow guards. They've helped me understand that his time here wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Richardson looked around at the assembled guards, many of whom were still visibly emotional. He could see Thomas standing at the edge of the group, clearly prepared to take responsibility for the situation. The colonel had dealt with breaches of protocol countless times throughout his career, but this situation was unlike anything he had encountered before. Guards, return to your posts, Richardson commanded, but his voice lacked its usual harshness. We'll address this situation through proper channels. As the guards began to disperse, many of them paused to say goodbye to Mr. Harrison. Each handshake and embrace was a moment of genuine human connection that transcended the usual boundaries of their service. Thomas remained behind, along with Captain Hayes and a few other senior guards. He stood at attention, ready to face whatever consequences awaited him. Sir, Thomas began, I take full responsibility for what happened here today. I initiated the contact with Mr. Harrison, and I encourage the others to join our conversation. Any disciplinary action should be directed at me alone. Richardson studied Thomas carefully. He had known the veteran guard for over a decade and had always respected his dedication and professionalism. This was completely out of character for him, which made the situation even more intriguing. 35 years of service, Richardson said quietly. And this is the first time you've broken protocol. Why now, Thomas? Thomas considered the question carefully. Sir, I realize that sometimes our humanity is more important than our regulations. Mr. Harrison needed comfort, and his son was one of ours. I couldn't stand by and watch him suffer alone when we had the power to help. And you were willing to risk your career for this moment? Richardson asked. Yes, sir. Some things are worth the risk. Mr. Harrison, who had been listening quietly, stepped forward again. Colonel, I hope you won't punish these guards for their kindness. What happened here today restored my faith in humanity. My son always spoke so highly of his service with the Queen's Guard, and now I understand why. You don't just train soldiers here. You develop men and women of character. Richardson felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced at David Harrison's funeral years earlier. He thought about his own son, currently serving in the Royal Navy, and wondered what he would want if something happened to him. Mr. Harrison, the colonel said formally, would you allow me to escort you on a proper tour of the facilities? I believe there are other places your son served that you haven't seen yet. The offer surprised everyone, including Richardson himself. It was unprecedented for a colonel to personally escort a civilian through the castle, but the circumstances seemed to call for unprecedented actions. Thomas watched in amazement as his commanding officer, known throughout the service for his rigid adherence to protocol, began walking slowly with the elderly veteran toward the main castle entrance. The two men talked quietly as they walked, sharing memories and stories about David Harrison. Captain Hayes approached Thomas as they watched the unlikely pair disappear into the castle. I've never seen anything like that, he said quietly. The colonel actually broke protocol himself. Maybe that's what this moment is about, Thomas replied thoughtfully. Maybe we all need to remember that rules serve people, not the other way around. Over the next hour, word of what had happened spread throughout the entire castle staff. Kitchen workers, maintenance personnel, administrative staff, and guards from other units all heard about the unprecedented gathering and the colonel's response to it. Some were critical, arguing that discipline and tradition were being undermined, but many others found themselves moved by the story, particularly those who had military experience or family members in service. Lady Catherine Pemberton, the castle's chief administrator, heard about the situation during her afternoon briefing. She was a practical woman who had worked at Windsor for over 20 years. and she understood the delicate balance between maintaining protocol and recognizing the human elements that made the royal household function. "This is either a disaster or an opportunity," she said to her assistant. "We need to think carefully about how we handle this situation." Meanwhile, Colonel Richardson continued his tour with Mr. Harrison, showing him the ceremonial halls where David had participated in state functions and the private areas where guards gathered during their off-duty hours. With each location, Richardson shared memories and insights about David's service that painted a picture of a dedicated and beloved young man. "Your son had a gift for making people feel valued," Richardson told Mr. Harrison as they walked through the guards' quarters. He remembered details about his colleagues' families, their interests, their concerns. It's a rare quality in anyone, but especially valuable in military service. Mr. Harrison smiled through his tears. His mother had that same gift. She could make anyone feel like the most important person in the room. As they concluded their tour, Richardson realized that something significant had shifted within him. The rigid adherence to protocol that had defined his entire career suddenly seemed less important than the human connections that gave meaning to their service. He thought about Thomas and the other guards who had broken ranks to comfort a grieving father, and he realized that their actions, while technically incorrect, had exemplified the very values that the Queen's Guard was meant to represent: honor, service, and protection of those who needed it most. The next morning brought unexpected visitors to Windsor Castle. News of the Guard's emotional gathering had somehow reached the media, though the reports were surprisingly respectful and positive. Rather than criticizing the breach of protocol, journalists were focusing on the human story of veterans supporting a grieving father and honoring a fallen comrade. Prince William, who served as Colonel-in-Chief of the Irish Guards, requested a private meeting with Colonel Richardson. The prince had his own military background and understood both the importance of discipline and the value of compassion in military service. "Colonel," Prince William said as they met in his private office, "I've been briefed on yesterday's events. I'd like to hear your perspective on what happened." Richardson had spent most of the night preparing for this conversation, knowing that his handling of the situation could have far-reaching consequences for his career and the entire Guard unit. "Your Royal Highness, what happened yesterday was unprecedented, but I believe it was also necessary," Richardson began carefully. "We witnessed something that reminded us all why we serve, not just to maintain tradition, but to honor the sacrifices of those who came before us and to support those who continue to serve." The prince listened intently as Richardson described the events of the previous day, from Thomas's initial decision to engage with Mr. Harrison, through the colonel's own choice to personally escort the grieving father through the castle. "And how do you plan to address the breach of protocol?" Prince William asked. Richardson had been dreading this question, but he had come to a decision during his sleepless night. "Sir, I believe what happened yesterday represents the highest values of military service. While the Guards technically violated protocol, they acted with honor, compassion, and dedication to a fellow veteran's family. I recommend that no disciplinary action be taken." Prince William was quiet for several moments, considering the colonel's words. His own military experience had taught him that sometimes the most important decisions couldn't be found in regulations or handbooks. "Colonel, I'd like to meet this Mr. Harrison," the prince said finally, "and I'd like to meet the guards who showed him such kindness." Meanwhile, Thomas had reported for duty expecting to face disciplinary action or even dismissal. Instead, he found himself assigned to light duties while the situation was being reviewed. Other guards approached him throughout the morning, expressing their support and sharing their own thoughts about what had happened. "You did the right thing," Sergeant Santos told him during a brief break. "David would have been proud to see how we honored his memory and supported his father." "I just hope it doesn't cause problems for everyone else," Thomas replied. "This is supposed to be my last week before retirement. I didn't want to leave behind a mess for you all to deal with." But the mess Thomas feared never materialized. Instead, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the castle. Staff members who had worked together for years but had rarely spoken beyond their official duties started having real conversations. The barriers that protocol had created between different ranks and departments began to break down. Kitchen staff shared stories about their own family members in military service. Maintenance workers talked about their fathers and grandfathers who had served in past wars. Administrative personnel opened up about their fears for relatives currently deployed overseas. The castle, which had always functioned efficiently as a workplace, was beginning to feel more like a community. Mr. Harrison, who had returned to his modest flat the previous evening with a heart full of new memories about his son, received an unexpected phone call that morning. Mr. Harrison, this is Lady Catherine Pemberton from Windsor Castle. His Royal Highness Prince William would like to invite you to return to the castle this afternoon for a private meeting. The elderly veteran was stunned. I don't understand. Did I cause trouble yesterday? I never meant to disrupt anything. Not at all, sir, Lady Pemberton assured him. Quite the opposite, actually. Your visit yesterday had a profound impact on everyone here, and the prince would like to thank you personally. When Mr. Harrison arrived at the castle that afternoon, he was escorted not to a formal meeting room, but to a comfortable sitting area, where Prince William waited with Colonel Richardson and several of the guards who had gathered around him the previous day, including Thomas. Mr. Harrison, Prince William said, rising to greet him, thank you for coming. I wanted to meet the man whose son made such an impact on our guards and whose visit reminded us all of what true service means. The prince's genuine warmth put Mr. Harrison at ease immediately. Your Royal Highness, I'm honored, but I think there's been some mistake. I'm just an old soldier who wanted to learn more about his son's service. And in doing so, you've taught us all something important, the prince replied. You've reminded us that behind every uniform is a person with a story, a family, and relationships that matter deeply. Prince William then did something that surprised everyone in the room. He asked each of the guards present to share their favorite memory of David Harrison. As the stories unfolded, he listened intently, asking questions and showing genuine interest in the young man they were honoring. Thomas found himself sharing the story of David's first ceremonial duty, when the young guard had been so nervous about making a mistake that he had practiced his movements for hours after his shift ended. He was determined to be perfect, Thomas said, smiling at the memory. But what made him special wasn't his precision, it was his heart. He genuinely cared about doing right by the crown, by his fellow guards, and by his family. That's exactly what we want in our guards, Prince William said. Technical skill is important, but character is essential. The conversation continued for over an hour, with everyone sharing stories and memories. Mr. Harrison learned details about his son's service that filled gaps in his understanding, while the guards gained a deeper appreciation for the family that had shaped the man they had respected and loved. As the meeting concluded, Prince William made an announcement that left everyone speechless. Mr. Harrison, I would like to establish an annual memorial service in honor of all Queen's Guards who have died in service to their country. We'll call it the David Harrison Memorial Service, and it will be held each year on the anniversary of your son's death. It will be a time for current guards to remember their fallen comrades and for families like yours to know that their loved one's service is never forgotten. Mr. Harrison's eyes filled with tears. Your Royal Highness, I don't know what to say. David would be so honored. It's we who are honored, Mr. Harrison, the prince replied. Your son's service and sacrifice deserve to be remembered, and yesterday's events showed us that our guards need a formal way to express their grief and support for each other. Thomas felt a profound sense of satisfaction as he listened to the prince's announcement. His decision to break protocol had led not to punishment, but to a permanent tribute that would honor David's memory and provide comfort to other military families for years to come. Colonel Richardson realized that what had started as a potential disciplinary crisis had evolved into an opportunity to strengthen the bonds between guards and create a more supportive environment for everyone who served. As they prepared to leave, Prince William approached Thomas privately. I understand you're retiring soon, he said. I want you to know that what you did yesterday exemplifies the very best of military service. You put compassion before regulation, and you honored a fallen comrade in the most meaningful way possible. Thomas stood a little straighter, feeling a pride in his service that went beyond any medal or commendation he had ever received. Thank you, sir. It was an honor to serve. 3 months later, Windsor Castle looked different than it had in decades. The changes weren't visible to casual observers, but anyone who worked there could feel the shift in atmosphere. The rigid formality that had once defined every interaction had been replaced by something warmer, more human, while still maintaining the respect and professionalism required for royal service. Colonel Richardson had implemented new policies that balanced tradition with compassion. Guards were now encouraged to participate in monthly discussion groups where they could talk about the challenges of military service, share concerns about family members, and support colleagues going through difficult times. The sessions were voluntary, but attendance was consistently high. Thomas had officially retired but had been asked to stay on as a consultant, helping to train new guards not just in protocol and procedures, but in the human aspects of their service. His first class of trainees was scheduled to graduate the following week, and he took pride in knowing that they would enter service with a deeper understanding of why their work mattered. "The uniform doesn't make you invisible," Thomas often told his trainees. "People see you as a symbol of service, dedication, and honor. Sometimes they need to connect with that symbol on a human level, and when that happens, you have a choice to make." The David Harrison Memorial Service had become a powerful annual tradition. The first service, held just 2 months after Prince William's announcement, had drawn not only current guards and castle staff, but also families of guards who had died in service going back decades. Mr. Harrison had been the guest of honor, and his speech about his son's dedication and the support he had received from the Queen's Guard had moved everyone present to tears. But perhaps the most significant change was in the daily interactions between guards themselves. The emotional walls that had existed for generations had begun to crumble, replaced by genuine friendships and support systems that made their demanding service more bearable. Sergeant Santos had been promoted to training instructor, working alongside Thomas to develop new approaches to guard education. She often thought about that day when David had helped her avoid fainting during ceremony, and she made sure that every new guard understood that looking out for fellow service members was just as important as maintaining proper form. "We protect the royal family," she would tell new recruits, "but we also protect each other. That's not written in any manual, but it's essential to who we are." Captain Hayes had been given a commendation for his handling of the situation with Mr. Harrison, recognizing his ability to balance military discipline with human compassion. The experience had changed his approach to leadership, and he now spent time getting to know his guards as individuals rather than just as soldiers under his command. The media attention surrounding the story had been overwhelmingly positive, with newspapers and television programs praising the guards for showing that military discipline and human kindness could coexist. Several other military units had reached out to learn about the changes being implemented at Windsor, hoping to create similar supportive environments for their own personnel. But the most meaningful changes were the small daily ones that most people never saw. Guards who had worked together for years were finally becoming friends. They shared meals, talked about their families, and supported each other through personal challenges. The isolation that had once been considered part of their professional identity had been replaced by a sense of community. Mr. Harrison had become a regular visitor to the castle, not as a grieving father seeking closure, but as a welcomed member of the extended military family that had embraced him. He often had lunch with guards during their breaks, sharing stories about his own military service and offering wisdom gained from decades of life experience. "You know," he told Thomas during one of their regular conversations, "David always said that his fellow guards were like brothers to him. I thought it was just military camaraderie, but now I understand that he meant it literally. You all really were his family." The changes at Windsor had also influenced the broader royal household. Prince William had spoken publicly about the importance of supporting military families and honoring the service of those who protect the crown. His words had resonated throughout the Commonwealth, inspiring similar initiatives at other royal residences and military installations. Queen Elizabeth herself had privately commended the guards for their compassion toward Mr. Harrison, noting that their actions exemplified the values that the monarchy sought to represent. Her quiet approval had validated the decision to prioritize humanity alongside protocol. Thomas often reflected on how a single moment of decision had led to such sweeping changes. His choice to remove his bearskin hat and speak honestly with a grieving father had seemed small at the time, but its ripple effects had transformed an entire institution. During his final week as a consultant, Thomas received a letter that moved him deeply. It was from a young soldier who had recently joined the Queen's Guard and had heard the story of what happened with Mr. Harrison. "Sir," the letter read, "your actions that day showed me what it really means to serve with honor. You taught me that being a good soldier isn't just about following orders perfectly, It's about knowing when to choose compassion over regulation, when to choose humanity over protocol. I hope to serve with the same courage and kindness you showed. The letter was signed by dozens of guards, both new and veteran, who wanted to express their gratitude for the changes that had made their service more meaningful and their workplace more supportive. On his final day at Windsor, Thomas stood once again at the main gate where he had first encountered Mr. Harrison. The bench where the elderly veteran had been sitting was now marked with a small plaque that read, "In memory of all Queen's Guards who have made the ultimate sacrifice, and in honor of the families who support them." As Thomas prepared to leave the castle for the last time as an employee, he was surprised to find dozens of guards, staff members, and even some royal family members gathered to see him off. The informal gathering would have been unthinkable just months earlier, but it now felt completely natural. Colonel Richardson stepped forward to address the group. "Thomas Mitchell has served this institution with distinction for 35 years, he said. But his greatest service may have been showing us that strength and compassion are not contradictory qualities, they are complementary, ones that make us better soldiers and better people." The applause that followed was warm and heartfelt, reflecting the genuine affection that had developed throughout the castle community. As Thomas walked toward the gate for the final time, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on the memorial bench. Mr. Harrison looked up and smiled, raising his hand in a gentle wave. The two men had developed a deep friendship over the past months, bonded by their shared love for David and their mutual respect for military service. "Going home, are you?" Mr. Harrison asked as Thomas approached. "Yes, sir. It's time for the next chapter," Thomas replied. Sitting down beside his friend, they sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, watching the current guards go about their duties with the same precision and dedication that had defined the Queen's Guard for centuries, but with something new added, a visible warmth and connection between colleagues that hadn't existed before. "You know," Mr. Harrison said quietly, "I came here that first day thinking I was just looking for closure about my son. I never imagined I was going to help change an entire institution." Thomas smiled. "Sometimes the most important changes start with the smallest acts of courage. You had the courage to ask about David, and somehow that gave me the courage to break a few rules. And look what happened." Mr. Harrison gestured toward the castle, where guards were going about their duties with the same professionalism as always, but with an added element of genuine care for each other that was evident in every interaction. As Thomas prepared to leave, Mr. Harrison reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the same photograph he had been holding that first day. The picture of young David in his uniform, standing proudly beside his family. "I want you to have this," he said, offering the photograph to Thomas. Thomas shook his head. "Sir, I couldn't. That's your most precious memory of David." "No," Mr. Harrison insisted, pressing the photograph into Thomas's hands. "My most precious memories of David are the ones you and the other guards gave me. The stories, the laughter, the understanding of who he really was during his service here. This photograph is just an image, but what you've all shared with me is David's living legacy." Thomas accepted the photograph with reverence, understanding the profound gift he was receiving. "I'll treasure it always," he promised. "I know you will. And Thomas, I want you to know that what you did that day, removing your hat, choosing compassion over protocol, that wasn't just kindness to an old man. That was leadership. You showed everyone around you that it's possible to honor tradition while still honoring humanity." The two men embraced, a gesture that would have seemed impossible between a veteran guard and a civilian just months earlier, but now felt completely natural and appropriate. As Thomas finally walked through the gates of Windsor Castle as a retired guard, he carried with him not just David's photograph but also the knowledge. 1 year after Thomas first removed his bearskin hat to comfort a grieving father, Windsor Castle hosted the second annual David Harrison Memorial Service. The ceremony had grown far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned, attracting military families, veterans, and service members from across the United Kingdom and Commonwealth countries. Mr. Harrison, now 79 and walking with the aid of a cane, stood before an audience of over 300 people gathered in the castle's main courtyard. His health had declined somewhat over the past year, but his spirit remained strong, buoyed by the community of support that had embraced him since that first emotional encounter. Last year, "I came to this castle as a lonely old man seeking to understand my son's life," he began, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. "Today I stand before you not as someone who has lost a son, but as someone who has gained a family of brave men and women who understand that true strength comes from taking care of each other." The audience, which included current Queen's Guards, retired military personnel, and family members of fallen service members, listened with rapt attention. Many had their own stories of loss and healing, their own experiences of finding comfort in unexpected places. Thomas sat in the front row, wearing a civilian suit but maintaining the proud bearing that had defined his military career. Beside him sat his wife Margaret, who had watched with amazement as her husband had been transformed by the events of the past year. The man who had come home from 35 years of rigid military service had gradually opened up, sharing stories and emotions that he had kept bottled up for decades. "The guards didn't just tell me about David's professional achievements," Mr. Harrison continued. "They shared the small moments that revealed his character. The time he helped a colleague through a difficult personal crisis, the way he remembered everyone's birthdays, the jokes he told to lift spirits during long shifts. These weren't the actions of just a good soldier, they were the actions of a good man." Sergeant Santos, now a senior training instructor, felt tears forming in her eyes as she remembered her friend and colleague. The support system that had developed among the guards over the past year had helped her deal with grief she hadn't even realized she was carrying. Colonel Richardson, who had become something of a reformer within military circles, spoke after Mr. Harrison. His remarks focused on the lessons learned from that transformative day and how they had been implemented not just at Windsor, but throughout the broader military establishment. "We learned that discipline and compassion are not opposing forces," Richardson said to the assembled crowd. "They are complementary strengths that make our military more effective and our service more meaningful. The courage to show humanity in the face of rigid protocol is just as important as the courage shown on any battlefield." The changes at Windsor had indeed spread throughout the military. Other units had implemented similar support programs, memorial services, and policies that recognized the importance of emotional well-being alongside physical and professional readiness. Military families reported feeling more supported, and service members spoke of improved morale and stronger bonds with their colleagues. But perhaps the most significant change was in the culture of the Queen's Guard itself. The new recruits entering service were trained not just in ceremonial duties and security protocols, but in the importance of looking after their fellow guards and connecting with the people they served. During the memorial service, Prince William delivered remarks that had been carefully crafted to honor not just David Harrison's memory, but the broader principles his story had come to represent. "The Queen's Guard has always been known for its precision, its discipline, and its unwavering dedication to duty," the prince said. "But this past year has reminded us that our greatest strength lies not in our ability to stand motionless for hours, but in our capacity to stand up for each other when it matters most." The ceremony concluded with the unveiling of a new memorial wall, featuring the names of all Queen's Guards who had died in service to their country. David Harrison's name was prominently displayed, along with dozens of others who had made the ultimate sacrifice. As families and colleagues searched for the names of their loved ones on the wall, something beautiful happened. People began sharing stories with each other, connecting over shared experiences of loss and service. Strangers became friends, united by their connection to the military family that extended far beyond any single unit or assignment. Thomas found himself surrounded by young guards who wanted to hear more about the day that had changed everything. He patiently answered their questions, sharing not just the facts of what had happened, but the emotions and decisions that had led to that moment of breaking protocol. "The hardest part wasn't removing my hat or talking to Mr. Harrison," Thomas told them. "The hardest part was admitting to myself that after 35 years of perfect adherence to regulations, I was willing to risk everything for something I believed was more important than the rules." One young guard, barely 20 years old, raised her hand. "But how did you know it was the right thing to do?" Thomas smiled, remembering asking himself the same question many times over the past year. "I didn't know for certain," he admitted, "but I knew that if I walked away from that grieving father without offering comfort, I would regret it for the rest of my life. Sometimes you have to trust your heart as much as your training, As the formal ceremony ended and people began to mingle, Mr. Harrison found himself overwhelmed by the number of military families who approached him to share their own stories. Parents, spouses, and children of service members spoke about their experiences, their fears, and their pride in their loved one's service. A young woman approached Mr. Harrison, holding the hand of a small boy who couldn't have been more than 5 years old. "Mr. Harrison," she said softly, "my husband is currently deployed with the Army. He heard about what happened here last year and he wanted me to thank you for showing that military families matter." The little boy looked up at Mr. Harrison with wide eyes. "My daddy is a soldier," he said proudly. "Are you a soldier too?" "I was a long time ago," Mr. Harrison replied, kneeling down to the child's level despite his aching joints. "And your daddy is very brave to serve our country. Will you tell me about being a soldier?" the boy asked. Mr. Harrison looked around at the gathering of military families, current service members, and veterans, all connected by their shared commitment to something larger than themselves. He thought about David, about Thomas, about all the guards who had opened their hearts to comfort a grieving father, and about the ripple effects that had spread from that one moment of human connection. "I'll tell you the most important thing about being a soldier," Mr. Harrison said to the young boy, his voice carrying to the adults who had gathered around to listen. "It's not about the uniform or the weapons or even the brave things you do. It's about taking care of the people around you, especially when they need you most." The boy nodded solemnly, as if understanding that he was receiving wisdom that went far beyond his years. As the sun began to set over Windsor Castle, the crowd slowly dispersed, but the connections made during the memorial service would last far longer than the formal ceremony. Military families had new support networks, service members had deeper friendships, and the culture of the Queen's Guard had been permanently transformed. Thomas and Mr. Harrison walked together one final time to the memorial bench where their friendship had begun. The plaque commemorating fallen guards gleamed in the fading sunlight, a permanent reminder of the sacrifice and service that had brought them together. "David would be amazed by all of this," Mr. Harrison said, gesturing toward the memorial wall and the groups of people still talking and sharing stories throughout the castle grounds. "I think he'd be proud," Thomas replied, "not just of the ceremony or the memorial, but of the way everyone has learned to take care of each other. That's what he was really about, making sure no one had to face their challenges alone." As they sat in comfortable silence, both men understood that they had been part of something much larger than a single act of kindness. They had helped prove that even the most traditional institutions could evolve, that strength and compassion could coexist, and that sometimes breaking the rules was the most honorable thing a person could do. The Queen's Guard continued their eternal watch, but they did so now with the knowledge that their service encompassed far more than ceremony and security. They were guardians not just of the royal family, but of each other, of military families like the Harrisons, and of the values that made their sacrifice meaningful. And in the heart of one of Britain's most traditional institutions, a revolution of compassion continued to grow, one human connection at a time.